You've got a quote that I find very interesting. So it's from page 60 of his book. It says, "I keep using the term anti-capitalist as opposed to socialist or communist to include people who publicly or privately question or loathe capitalism, but do not identify as socialist or communist." I mean, to me, this just sounds like sketchy. Like, and I just say that because it's like, well, or deceptive. Like, I want to use a term that maybe people will be softer to, even though I'm really a socialist. Now, maybe I'm that's probably not a fair classification. He would argue, no, I'm trying to do it for those who are inherently anti-socialist, but maybe don't realize they really shouldn't be. But it's slippery because you're creating up a new term. Like anti-capitalist. Okay, what do you mean by that? Right? So it sort of allows this idea of he's able to create terms as we go along, as opposed to using, predetermined or just strict definitions. That I don't know. Just it becomes harder to argue when you're creating new terms, because now everyone sort of has to get orientated as to what you're actually saying. So why did you think it was so important to highlight this anti-capitalist component of his book and character?
I think it's important because when I think of economics, I think of the science of making choices, the reallocation of scarce resources. And so like the science of economics is, if you have a sound understanding of it, it can help economic mobility. That's why it's important to get the math right, so to speak. And so whether you're capitalist or socialist or whatever sphere you fall on, like sound economics should lead to progress. And so that's the angle I was coming at it from. And as you'll see that I'm making the argument that capitalism has been helpful in helping Black people progress, as opposed to not. And that's the argument that Kendi is making.
Yeah, I mean, he's essentially making the argument that slave owners are capitalists.
Yes. So he makes the argument that racism and capitalism are twins, are conjoined twins, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And so the reason why the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade happened is because of capitalism. The reason why, And so,
yeah, those are his positions.
But and as I say in the paper, but that's a common position though, in the Black community. It's common to associate capitalism with racism and the slave trade.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'd have to go digging to find a link for this, but I think even it might be Bob Murphy has written an article that sort of hypothesizes that actually slavery made us worse off in the long run. Like, it's not that slavery created any sort of prosperity today. It's actually that because you lacked property rights and because people had the inability to allocate their own resources where they deemed the most appropriate, you're actually hindering the long-term productivity of society. Now, that would go so antithetical to so many arguments about slavery, whether that's reparations or other arguments. But I think it's important to understand that it's not, the only reason I bring it up is to demonstrate that it's not that simple, right? You can't just, well, because someone exploited someone else, therefore, they were capitalists and somehow, capitalism is to blame. From a free market perspective, the lack of free market that slaves had to allocate their own labor actually hinders society. And to go along with that, the amount of costs needed to enforce slaves, being someone else's property, when you have, people running away, those are just wasted costs. on society. So there's, again, I only bring it up just to say, in line with what you've said, that like, oh, this argument is common, that slavery and capitalism kind of go hand in hand. There are good, and that's a strong economics based argument that he makes to show, if we were looking at economics from a both sort of theoretical perspective, as well as sort of, economic, if we try to do some economic calculations, we can show that, it actually didn't result in a net benefit for society as a whole. So now would you say that his sort of anti-capitalist classification of capitalist classification of slave owners is due to the secondary primary source issue?
Oh yes, yeah, most definitely, and yeah, I would definitely say that, because like and I give three main points of three anti-abolitionists, three slave owners, prominent slave owners who wrote on this issue and debated this issue, and they were basically saying that they were anti-capitalist, and these guys were it was John C. Calhoun, 1782 to 1850, and then George Fitzhugh, 1806 to 1881, and James Henry Hammond, 1807 to 1864. And I use three of these guys, and I go to their work, and I'm reading their work, and they're making arguments on why slaves shouldn't be free. And the argument they're using on why slaves shouldn't be free is because capitalism is terrible. It's worse. It's better off for blacks to be slaves than for them to be in a quote unquote capitalistic economy. And it's funny because when you read it, you're like, oh wow, like these guys are really making arguments why it's better for a slave to be under free labor than paid labor. And so these guys are making arguments why why slave, and it's twisted, but the arguments they're using, and they're arguments we use today. It's stuff we hear today, and that's the scary part, where we're like, okay, well, if they're against anti-racism, or if they're against anti-capitalism and you're against anti-capitalism, then sorry, I thought you were against these guys. So why are you peddling the same economic principles as slaveholders?
Yeah, it's I think that's where you're shining some good light into this conversation.
Right. And then on the flip side, I show the abolitionists. And I just mentioned some abolitionists who were for the free market, right? So think about it. If anti-abolitionists are using these arguments to keep blacks enslaved, what kind of arguments do you think the abolitionists are using? Think about it, right? Part of understanding history is putting history in its context. If these white racist people are saying, let's keep blacks enslaved because capitalism is bad for them, what kind of arguments do you think the abolitionists are making? And so I name dropped a couple guys. I name dropped Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Alodu Equiano. These are men that Equiano bought his own freedom, and he had his own slave narrative that did really well, and he documents his time in slavery. And he said that prior to him being bought into slavery, he was already a slave in Africa. And he documents that in great detail in him being a slave in Africa before he became a slave under whites. Right. And then him talking, and now since he bought his freedom, now he's fighting for the freedom of blacks. And he works along William Wilberforce in the Clapham sect in England to abolish slavery. in England. And then you have Booker T. Washington, who once he's free, he creates the Tuskegee Institute. Now, I don't talk about this in the paper, but so I'm just giving you some context. But you have Booker T. Washington talking about, okay, now we're free. What are we going to do? Well, I'm going to create the Tuskegee Institute, which is an institute that is going to teach Black people skills, like trade skills, so that they can have skills to contribute to the economy, so that they would be able to create wealth and a living for themselves, which is a free, which these are free market principles. Also, Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass, one of his speeches, he says, what shall we do? White people are saying, what shall we do with the Negro now that he's free? What shall we do with the Negro now that he's free? Right? Well, today, what would they say? What shall we do with the Negro? What would people say today if they're listening? Frederick Douglass asked that question. They're going to say, okay, well, we should help them. We should, create programs for them and come alongside them. Well, Frederick Douglass says, do nothing with us. Do nothing with us. Let us stand on our own feet. Right? Right? So these are guys who are at odds with the anti-abolitionists. And so these are the arguments. These are the contextual historical arguments about what economic ideas are helpful for Black people and which ones aren't. And then I show people today. Sorry, you're gonna say something?
I was just gonna say, yeah. It's good to point out, because like you would think, okay, whatever the economic ideas of those who wanted to maintain slavery, we should be considering, chances are we don't want those ones. And those who are against slavery, what are the economic ideas that they're promoting? Right? Like it's worthy of consideration. And this is where, I always make I'd make this claim against Kendi, that are you being objective? Right? Are you looking for a narrative? Are you looking to prove your point? Or are you looking to be objective and evaluating? Because, from the way he's presented it is like, well, secondary sources, you've got it twisted, right? You haven't dug in and tried to say, okay, let's present both ideas and weigh them against each other and see, why would one group hold one and why would the other hold the other, and evaluate them, with an honest sort of, no, he's clearly presenting one portion of the entire, conversation in order to reiterate his own points.
But I would say that's for good reason. He does that for good reason. And the reason, so I say in the post, I say, sadly, in the Black community, capitalism is blamed for the transatlantic slave trade. I believe this is due to trusting the secondary sources of Black people over the primary sources of white people. Who can blame us? Can you blame us for doing that? No, you can't. You can't. And I agree with Kendi on that. This is why most Black people are like, well, you can't trust white people. You can't, right? In order for you to survive and to push along, you can't trust white work. You can't trust white history. So the secondary sources, right? Because, people will say, okay, history is written by the victors. And so for Black thinkers, current Black thinkers are saying, okay, well, we're thinking and we're going to speak for our people. You no longer speak for our people. So we're going to speak for our people. And so whatever we see from these primary sources from white people, we're not going to rock with it. We're going to come with our own ideas. And some of these ideas have manifested itself in Pan-Africanism. Now, I don't talk about Pan-Africanism in the post because it's not good to add new ideas, too many ideas to a thought. But just to add context, like, so Pan-Africanism is a worldwide movement that aims to encourage and strengthen bonds of solidarity between all indigenous and diaspora ethnic groups of African descent. So what that means is that for those people who were descendants who came to the Americas from Africa are part of the diaspora. And so the idea is to unite all Black people from the diaspora and back to the motherland as one people, as one unit, to support each other spiritually and also materially. So it's also like an economic principle. It embodies economic principles. So this is something I grew up hearing. This is something that's normal. It's a normal narrative of the Black experience. And so this is where Kendi is coming from, and many people who are anti-capitalists are coming from.
Please subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date. If you liked or disliked the snippet, give it a like and share your 2 cents with us in the comment section. And remember, 6 cents makes change.